Welcome back. Good to have you with us again. We are in the middle of talking about Calvin and his discussion of the Ten Commandments. We're really on the third video of this, and we're really picking up on what we had seen in the last video. The last video, if you haven't seen it, you should take a look at that first, helps us see that there is, in fact, a way in which God has the first four commandments as really a summary of Jesus' commands to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then the last six of the commandments to be Jesus' second great commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. So we have these two working together, loving God and loving neighbor. And one of the important things that Calvin wants us to see here is that God means for us to not only have one be the first that is most important and the other one being second that is perhaps second in importance, but also to say that it's only when you make progress in the one that you will have the ability to make progress in the other. Some people have sort of given up perhaps on the first table. They don't love God the most, or they're not really working on it that much. They're spending much of their energy in not lying and not stealing, and so on. And so they're really working on the second table. And Calvin says that's a mistake. It's a mistake to basically forget the first one. As a matter of fact, it's only when you make progress on the first one that you will be able to make any headway on the second. The second is actually just an evidence that you've actually worked on the first one, that you've achieved loving God, in a sense, more in proportion to the amount that he deserves to be loved. And here's a good example. When it comes to loving your neighbor, some of you may have a pretty rotten neighbor, a neighbor that's maybe one of the bigger jerks on the planet, and it would really be difficult for you to love him. You find it very difficult. You find it very hard. He's bad in just about every conceivable way. And when you look at him and you think, well, I need to love him, and you try to find something lovely in him to love, then you're baffled. You can't find anything. There's nothing there to love. And what Calvin wants to say is that the problem is that you shouldn't be looking for something lovely in your neighbor in order to be able to love your neighbor. You need to have a love for the one who commands you to love your neighbor. Love God. And there's plenty to love in God. There's nothing to not love in God. He is totally the one that if you considered him and reflected on who he is, you would love him. Love him. And if you grow in a love for him, you will, because you love him, love to do what he says and love to love your neighbor. You will be willing to love your neighbor. And again, but if you think you have to find something lovely in your neighbor to love your neighbor, you'll never be able to do it in certain cases. But if you love God, loving him will enable you to make progress in the second table. And so this is the logic of the first and second table. The logic is, out of the overflow of your love for God, you will love your neighbor. And if you skip the loving God part, you'll just fail it at all. You won't make any progress in the second table at all because you skipped the most important part, loving God. And so this is another helpful insight from Calvin. We must love God, and out of the overflow of our love for God, we will love our neighbor. And this, I think, is a good strategy for us to pursue. First and foremost, every day, we want to have our hearts happy in the Lord, loving him most. And as we make progress, as he, by his help, we make progress in this, we will find ourselves able to glorify him by loving our neighbor as ourself. Well, I hope this has been helpful to you.